my life. And so this is my opportunity to, any opportunity I have to talk about him, to talk about his work, to talk about that milieu of late 19th century, early 20th century, you know, Caribbean, New York City, the Atlantic world on this side, I guess. You know, I jump at that opportunity.
Well, awesome. And I must admit, I too have an affinity for Mr. Schomburg. He was a member of my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, initiated at the Omicron chapter circa 1920. And that period of African American history is one of my specialties, turn of the century, circa 1900 till about 1930, Harlem radicalism, the formation of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which I'm an executive council member of, and him being a bibliophile and collecting all those documents and artifacts that became the foundation for the Schomburg Center in Harlem, New York. So just thank you for doing the work that you did and agreeing to do this webinar for the community, for our students here at Western Carolina University, and as well as for my fraternity and Schomburg's fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Absolutely. No, my pleasure.
Indeed. So I'm going to begin by having you do a brief overview of who Alfonso Arturo Schomburg was and how he came to arrive in New York City at the turn of the century.
So Arturo Alfonso Schomburg is born in San Mateo de Cangrejos, Puerto Rico. This is important because today it is a town called Santurce. It is right outside the capital of San Juan, Puerto Rico. He is born to a free Black woman named Maria Josefa, or Mary Joseph, whose family was from St. Thomas and St. Croix. So at that point, when I'm speaking, sometimes when I speak with students, I bring up the map of the Caribbean, because sometimes we don't really understand the distances or the proximity of things, right? So at this moment, for example, the St. Thomas and St. Croix today are part of the US Virgin Islands. Back then, they were part of the Danish West Indies, right? So we don't think of Denmark as having a stake in the transnational multi-billion-dollar corporation that was the Atlantic slave trade, but it too had islands, right? This was its imperial moment. Puerto Rico at the time was part of the Spanish empire, right? Puerto Rico, Cuba, both of those islands. And those islands are right next to Puerto Rico. And so his mother's family, the maternal line, is from those islands. The paternal line, the Schomburgs, were a Puerto Rican family that had been in Puerto Rico already since at least the 1820s. And so this is the 1820s Puerto Rico, 1820s Spanish Empire is a moment when the Spanish crown encouraged European settlements on their lands, right? And so you had Germans coming and settling as well. So settler colonialism, I think, is really important because sometimes we don't think about it in different contexts, right? And so the Schomburgs are a family that had been there already for 50 years. So we don't know the circumstances of these two people coming together. What we do know is that there is a grandmother, there's a Mrs. Schomburg who is signed on his baptismal certificate. We know that Schomburg is his last name. And so, speculation about, is he really their son? All of this. I mean, there we are talking about patronage. We are talking about godparents within a Latin American context, not just a Catholic context, but a context of European families taking on perhaps Black families, right? And so it's really important that she was a free woman. He is born a year, several months after the end of enslavement in Puerto Rico. He's born January 1874. Enslavement is ended March 1873. This is really important, again, because we don't think about enslavement necessarily touching, right, islands, or sometimes people go, maybe they know about Cuba, maybe they know about Brazil. They do not know that enslavement, the trafficking of Africans and their descendants happens across this hemisphere, right, and touched every single country in this hemisphere. So that's the preamble. San Mateo de Cangrejos is the only town that was founded by self-emancipating Black peoples in Puerto Rico. That's really important because I have a colleague who has said that when I say self-emancipating, I'm talking maroons, in Spanish, cimarrones, right? Those who break free from enslavement, who were escaping from the surrounding islands, and they would get to that town and they were free. They would go, if they were coming from Protestant lands, those islands, the Spanish church or the Spanish crown wanted them to be baptized Catholic, and then they could stay free. And so he's born almost 100 years after the founding of that space. The story is that when he was a child and he was in school in San Mateo de Cangrejos, that he wanted to learn about his heroes. And the teacher apparently said, well, your people have no heroes. There's some ambiguity here, right? Because to this day, it's really in the last 10 to 15 years that you see a much more live and in-person consciousness of Afro-Puerto Rican identity, right? At the time, you definitely have Afro-Cuban identity, right? That was in Spanish, you had Afro-Cubanos, you had the phrase gente de color, right? People of color, to refer to people of African descent on that island. In Puerto Rico, not so much. And so the story as it gets translated into English goes, because again, speaking Spanish, right? I remind people of that because we have no recording of Arturo Schomburg, even though he died in 1938. We don't know how he sounded. So let's take for granted that he was born and raised in an island where there was Spanish, and then he had family in the neighboring islands where there was some kind of Danish and then was some kind of English. Multilingual man who most certainly probably had an accent of some kind that we don't identify, right? We don't readily identify necessarily. And so, but the story gets past is that, you know, in keeping with Enlightenment ideals, that Black peoples had no history, that Africans had no history. And so the story is that that settled with him, right? And that from that point on, he was trying to always gather the evidences of global Black excellence, right? Not just necessarily even Puerto Rican excellence, Caribbean excellence, right? It was, he continued to grow and expand. At 17 years old, he comes to New York City. New York City at the end of the 17th century, within a Spanish context, is a space where Black Cubans and Black Puerto Ricans were being exiled because they were calling for independence from Spain. They were calling, and not calling for just talking. He comes here in 1891. By that point, Cuba has already seen 2 wars of independence, 1868 to 1878 and 1881 to 1882. So Cuba already is gathering, is organizing. There are people who are fighting, right? And mostly that revolutionary army is mostly Afro-Cuban, right? Predominantly Afro-Cuban, right? In Puerto Rico, which is a smaller island, not as populated, and was really used as a fortress, you still have Black Puerto Ricans who were joining their Black Cuban brethren to rise up. And so you have these communities here in New York City. If anyone knows anything about Manhattan, they'd be shocked to know that at one point, the lower Manhattan was full of tobacco factories. Oh, wow. Because there were people, they would bring there was tobacco factories up here. There were also sugar factories up here in terms of refining the sugar. So thinking about the Caribbean, particularly in relation to New York City, people sometimes think about the 1960s West Side Story, much longer history with both of those islands. And so there was a community of Black Cubans and Black Puerto Ricans that were here, not only calling for independence, they were organizing, they were raising money, they were trying to fund guns, they were trying to get back down to the islands. And he arrives at 17 years old and is part of that, right? And is part of, there was the Cuban Revolutionary Party was here. Jose Marti is, for lots of people, the father of the Cuban nation, of Cubans across the political spectrum recognize Jose Marti. He was here in New York. He was traveling between New York and Tampa, right? And so, Arturo Schomburg at 17, 18, 19 is with these groups, with these revolutionary clubs, raising money. He's a secretary of one of the clubs called the Dos Antillas, meaning the two Antilles. So Cubans and Puerto Ricans were working like this to free their nations. And so that's what he's working on. And he's a porter, he's a bellhop, he's working in a print shop, he's getting married, he's starting to have kids, he's initiated into the Freemasons, like he's doing all of these things up until 1898, when the United States intervenes in what is the third Cuban War for Independence, which started in 1895. 1898, the United States intervenes. By the end of 1898, Cuba is declared a protectorate of the United States. Puerto Rico becomes a colony of the United States effectively, which it continues to be since 1898. And that revolutionary fervor kind of scatters. And so you have people who go back to Cuba. One of the colleagues that I write about in Diasporic Blackness, his name is Rafael Serra, who's a man who he himself had been enslaved at one point, self-emancipated, set up schools in Cuba, comes to New York, sets up schools here, right? And so I say that to say, sets up newspapers, goes back to Cuba at the end of that war, gets into the government, because being an educated citizen was so deeply important to these Black populations, right? Many times when we talk about education, and it's sometimes linked, literacy is often linked to the freedom struggle. Education has to be a part of that. And how throughout this hemisphere, Black peoples across the hemisphere, across languages, we are teaching ourselves and each other, right? In a segregated United States, right? And so even up north, where people think like, no, I was still segregated, right? And so those revolutionaries, you know, they take a variety of journeys, right? Rafael Serra goes back to Cuba and is dedicated to that. A lot of the Puerto Ricans, everybody kind of scatters. And so Arturo Schomburg is one of the ones that stays in New York, and really he himself becomes this kind of translational bridge building figure, right? Between a Spanish-speaking Black population of Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and then the next wave of migration that comes from the islands, which is from the British West Indies, right? And the African-American population that's coming due to the Great Migration. So that's what Harlem is. It's that mix of all of the diaspora. and he has touch points with all of the communities.
Indeed. Now, I want to ask, and I'm glad you said those things, because people, many are forgotten to history, and scholars have resurrected their memory and legacy. People like Hubert Harrison, which has been viewed by many scholars, including Perry, as the dean of Harlem radicalism. And he was one of those West Indian, English-speaking diasporic figures. But did Schomburg, is there anything on the record on his view of what, if we view it from a U.S.-centered perspective, of the Spanish-American War and the outcome of, or maybe even Teddy Roosevelt with his racist ass and how he tried to manipulate, I mean, I'm just calling how I see it. Yeah. How he tried to manipulate propaganda to position himself to be a hero in the U.S. campaign in Cuba, in eliminating or erasing Black soldiers' key roles in the U.S. victory over the Spanish Empire.
Mhm. Yeah, no, he was deeply disappointed with, like many of them. It wasn't just, it's an interesting thing, right? Because when we talk about colonialism, right, and we talk about migration that results, right? Migration, exile, being a refugee, right? Where people wind up is very interesting. He was very critical of US foreign policy, right? Very critical of some of his earliest writings are letters to the New York Times, right? Around this time of 1901, 1902, there was a series of Supreme Court cases called the Insular cases, that at the end of which they said that Puerto Rico specifically, but all of these territories, because Spain loses Guam, the Philippines, these were the last remnants of this. Well, that's not true. These were some of the last remnants of the Spanish Empire, because Spain's incursions into Africa and the African continent is almost never discussed. And the fact that there's a Spanish Equatorial Guinea, there's a Spanish Western Sahara, Spain at one point is controlling Morocco into the 20th century. That is almost never discussed, right? So for those of you who are interested in Spain and its relationship with the African continent, please know it extends beyond enslavement into well into the 20th century. Backtrack. So yeah, he's deeply disappointed, as they all were. I mean, I think part of the reason you see the scattering of these revolutionaries, men and women alike, because their wives were also a part of this. There were men's clubs and there were women's clubs, but all were organizing and raising money, is that they were heartbroken. Right. And what do you do when it's an interesting thing? What do you, we know that the refrain of what happens when a dream is deferred, right? Now take that as nation building. Take that as truly people, like they knew they were on the verge of it. That's what and then here comes the colossus that is, right, the United States, right? And part of the way that the United States, when anyone studies the Spanish-American War, they studied the USS Maine and the explosion in Havana Bay, and the role of the newspapers at the time, right, that really trumped this up in terms of like US bravery and all that. The other part of it was racism. The other part of it was many of the soldiers, not only, as you point out, right, African-American soldiers in the US Army, right? But you also had, again, Afro-Cubans in the Cuban Revolutionary Army, right? Puerto Ricans that were like heading to Cuba to help. And it was and I use the word deliberately, the specter of the Haitian Revolution, right? Yeah. You had Spanish soldiers going to those Cuban soldiers that were of white European heritage saying, I mean, can you really trust them with the country? You see what's happening in Haiti. Right. And so there was a deliberate, like you literally had, there's documented letters and archival research done on white soldiers who were wanted independence from Spain, that once that thought hit, or once those thoughts were circulated, they put their arms down and they said, we're not going to fight on behalf of our own independence. Indeed. And so really what is deeply interesting to me always, right, is we know the history that we learn in schools. Yes. And then those of us who do Black studies work, right, we then go and go, okay, wait, what does Carter G. Woodson say? What's happening in the Journal of Negro Life? What's happening in the College Language Association? What's happening in the Black newspapers? How were they reporting this? Because that perspective is so deeply important. And that's where we get a version that we're not necessarily going to get in the textbooks unless we're writing the textbooks.
Indeed, indeed. And that leads me to another question. I think what is often overlooked is Schomburg's journalism and his writings. Mm-hmm. And putting it in context of, if we study Black radicalism and Black abolitionism, the Black freedom struggle, however we want to frame it, whatever language we choose, the independent Black press, yes, has been central and has been key, going all the way back during slavery in the Americas, because we can find that throughout the Americas, not simply in what we now call the United States of America. Could you tell us a little bit more, because you mentioned some of his writings for the New York Times, his contributions to that literary and protest tradition using the printed word?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting again, right? So the first evidence of him writing is letters to the New York Times, which was a predominantly white readership at the time, right? So he knows where he's writing, and he is published there as A. Schomburg, right? So people ask about, they ask me, why is your book Arturo Alfonso, right? Why this is a man that we know as Arthur Schomburg, right? And I said, and what is the A versus the AA versus the Arturo versus the Arthur? And I said, well, part of it is audience, right? Part of it is literally the, letters to the editor had this much space. So they would put A. Schomburg. Part of it is him translating, right, to different audiences. I call him, I named this book, The Life and Times of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, because that is the name that appears on his birth certificate. And that is also the name that appears that he uses towards the end of his life. While he is in New York City, right? So I said he moved here. It was a time when he lived in Harlem, but he settles out in Brooklyn, right? And he is friends with anybody and everyone. He's working with all these folks that today we recognize as like the Harlem Renaissance, right? So for example, Charles S. Johnson, who's heading up Opportunity, right? That is one of his closest friends. Like the magnificence, the Schomburg Center right now is digitizing a good part of Arturo Schomburg's correspondence. And I have said for years, man, there's whole books to be gleaned, right, from correspondence, in addition to like the regular Harlem gossip, which if anyone ever has, not even Harlem gossip, any gossip, if anyone has a chance to go to letters, to go to an archive and read how people talk about each other, the reason it's funnier in the Harlem Renaissance, because all of those folks are famous, right? So meaning what people want to say about County Cullen getting married to like Yolanda Du Bois, right? Like, uh-oh, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. So Charles S. Johnson with Opportunity, he is publishing some of his earliest articles in the crisis, meaning he's interfacing with W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And so, for example, there is an event in 1912 that happens in Cuba, whereby you had the veterans of those Cuban independence movements, these Afro-Cuban, Black Cuban military veterans decided to form a political party, right? Because they said their government, a decade into independence, right? They were a protectorate from 1898 to 1902. From 1902, Cuba is an independent country. A decade later, they said, this is not serving our interests. They had already seen that the political parties had edged them out, right? In this sense of like raceless, Cuba is for everyone. And so they formed a partido, the Partido de Color, right? I'm misremembering the name of it, but it was all veterans, and you had a Cuban government that unleashed their army and massacred this Black army, this collection of Black veterans. Mm-hmm. And it was called the Little War of 1912. Mm-hmm. Arturo Schomburg writes about it in the pages of the crisis to say, this is what's happening over there, right? And so at this moment, through the course of US history, and there are moments when an African-American population, not moments, the African-American population, different segments of it, depending on the region, has always been attuned to what's happening, right, in the rest of this hemisphere, right? It is, I think sometimes history is written such that, oh no, it's very parochial, we're just focusing on the United States. That is not how people were living. And that's not how Du Bois was publishing, even back then, at the beginning of the century. And so I think it's the reason I titled this book Diasporic Blackness is that our Blackness in this country has always been more complex, right? It is not just a very simple, oh, okay, so Black people only live in one part of this country under a certain set of conditions. Black peoples have always lived in this country free, enslaved, somewhere in between, depending on what region of the country. Sometimes they're coming from the Caribbean as well. Sometimes, you know, there's all of these different infusions. And so our Blackness, I think, is inherently diasporic. And there's a richness and there's a nuance there. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be a focus on the US experience. There absolutely should be. But for me, it's always, I pay attention to what gets erased, right? Because ultimately, when we're talking about discourses, that becomes a conversation about power. And it becomes a conversation about whose narrative is more important, whose narrative is front and center. And for me, personally, I like the richness and the depth, because I like complicating simplistic visions, because it means that more people were more involved, more eyes were involved, more voices were involved than we give credit.
Indeed, indeed. And I think for my students listening, that's what I mean in class when I say we have to problematize and historicize some of these things to address those things that Dr. Valdés mentioned. And to the novices and to my students who may not be aware, The Crisis was a magazine published by the NAACP, founded by one of its key principal founders, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, which is another discussion because they stripped his editorship several times. But the reasons being, we may even end up discussing it, is a conversation for a different time. Now, when I was doing my dissertation research and I was looking at African publications in South Africa, and during the turn of the century, when it was still a Commonwealth, it was just forming as the Union government of South Africa, and people like Sao Plaki and others who were in communication with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, they spoke. There were several references to the work that Schomburg was doing, and they were viewing it through the lens of, I guess you could say, cultural or historical preservation, right? I was wondering if you could speak to, you already mentioned of his impetus to start collecting these artifacts and documents or whatever, but can you speak to his contribution to what we would now call public history? Shameless plug for the history department here, because we have a public history program, but also to historical conservation and public history. Because just as Du Bois is the father of applied or American sociology, in many ways, Schomburg should be in the conversation of one of the key pioneers of public history and historical preservation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I think that, so what's really interesting to me in the time, so I wrote this book, or I published this book, and I didn't publish it. It was published in 2017, paperback in 2018. And I will probably, you know, I say this as this is recorded, so I will probably at some point write a second rendition of this book, or a continuation of this book, one that is focusing more on the networks of people. Because, you know, you mentioned Asala, right? ASALH and Carter G. Woodson, and none of these folks were working by themselves. They were all working together. There were various learned organizations. The American Negro Academy was one of them. Du Bois at one point was a president, right? Carter G. Woodson was part, that was the first learned society, right? There was the Negro Society for Historical Research, which is founded around the same time as what comes to be known as Asala. Asala is the one that survives that moment. It is the only one that continues to survive and thrive. And you know, bless the infrastructure, right, that Dr. Woodson built into that organization. And so I say that to say that in the same way that the sharing of knowledge, the dispersal of knowledge, the recovery of histories that had to that point been erased, right? You had these men and women who were mostly men. There were, but only because the men only allowed themselves to be there.
Yes.
Women were consigned often to librarians, but they were there. but you had the gathering of this and then the sharing out of the knowledge. So Arturo Schomburg, where he gets one of the reasons that he starts gaining fame is because people say that he is endless in his pursuit, like his energy, right, was one where New York City, I was talking about, there were tobacco factories here. There also used to be way more bookstores, right? New York continues to be a center for publishing, but there used to be like just stalls and stalls and stalls of bookstores. And so what he would do is he would just go and, there was a point when Black history wasn't a separate shelf, right? It was just, oh, you could just be going through. If anyone visits New York City, first, I invite you to come visit New York City. I invite you to come to what is the last remainder, really, of that tradition, and that's called the Strand's Bookstore. And it is on 12th Street. And the Strand's has miles of books, but when you get to that bookstore, it is a phenomenal bookstore. You go outside and there's racks of used books, and you can buy books for $1, $2, literally. And so at the time, that's what he would do. Like, that was a tradition where you would go and, oh, okay, well, oh, look, this is a pamphlet published of Phyllis Wheatley's poetry for $0.25. And he would buy it. Every opportunity that he had to gather, he was doing that. There was a whole, along this Northeast corridor from Boston, down New York, Philly, DC, right? There were folks all along this corridor who were exchanging, hey, did you see this? Hey, this bookseller's doing this. And then the books, they're writing to the booksellers are writing to them. Hey, we have this catalog of stuff. And so that exchange of like the gathering impulses, out of that is born a Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. Out of that is born what was then the Negro collection of literature, history, and prints, which is what he was contributing to prior to his own private collection being bought by the Carnegie Corporation in order to donate it to the New York Public Library. It was this sense of, we need to know our own history, and we need to, and I appreciate you putting him in the realm of public history, because that is absolutely correct. I speak about it in terms of implicit versus explicit history making, right? And so we live in a time when still, right, this idea of you have to have a certain degree to be able to do certain things. And, if you talk to certain people, they say, oh no, you can't do X until you get a PhD or you get a master's degree. Arturo Schomburg was a man who had a high school degree. And I emphasize that for audiences, because it's one of the reasons why his own contemporaries kind of didn't know what to do with him, right? Because Du Bois was, the first Black PhD from Harvard, right? Woodson had a PhD, like Charles Johnson had a PhD. Like, these were folks who were learned people who were getting degrees from some of the, the esteemed institutions in this country. He did not. He had a high school diploma, but his curiosity was endless, and he was reading constantly, and so that could not be denied by his contemporaries. And then he gets in position where he's starting to curate shows, right? So he'll curate an exhibition at the Harlem YMCA, at the Brooklyn, one of the Brooklyn branches of the YMCA, of the New York Public Library, right? So again, he was someone, in one of his articles or one of his speeches, he talked about, it did not matter where the knowledge came from, right? The important thing was culling together the knowledge and sharing it. And so we currently live in a moment where, when I talk about Afro-Latin American studies, for example, Afro-Latinx studies, people have asked me, or I've gotten that question. And part of the proliferation of that knowledge is social media, right? Is that people are posting things on TikTok and on Twitter and on Instagram. And we are in some ways hearkening back to our ancestors a century ago, who are just teaching each other and sharing it out, right? Because there are people who are going, you know what, I'm not gonna get a PhD, but you know what I could do? I can read this and I can share what I've read, right? And I can go, okay, this book says X, right? And that it's a phenomenal thing to witness right now, is to see the multiple modes and modalities of literacy and knowledge sharing that we are doing at this moment, because that too is public history. And so, no, I think he is, I really appreciate you framing him as someone in that space, because he was absolutely one of the pioneers of it.
Indeed. And I think one of the key aspects of praxis for Black studies is, in many ways, you could say a continuation or a tribute to his work. What we're doing here and what will be its outcome is this webinar will be accessible to people who are not college students, who are not Western Carolina University students, who are not SUNY students, who will be able to get access to this. And I think he would be proud. And I just want to add, that's something that people don't want to talk about and have had trouble problematizing, is the elitism of some of my heroes, of Du Bois, of Woodson. Woodson was the second PhD from Harvard, right, in history, and Du Bois was the first. How at certain instances, they try to admonish Schomburg based on their elitism. I know a former president of ASALH, Dr. Darrell Scott, him and I would discuss that because, he looked at a lot of the letters and correspondence and notes of Dr. Woodson, and they would often say, things that you would be ashamed of that our heroes said, but they're human. They were human beings. Du Bois said a lot of terrible things about Garvey that we are aware of, right? Colorism played a lot into it, back and forth between Garvey and Woodson, if we're being honest, right? And I want to mention to my fraternity brothers, it's important because Schomburg was initiated by our Omicron chapter at Columbia University, right? And it was during the time that we were still doing what people would call today honorary. We no longer do honorary. We haven't done it in almost 100 years. But Schomburg was one of the last brothers. And it was because of his accomplishments and what he was doing in the community. And as we know, it was circa about 18 years before he passed away. So it was a little bit later in his life, but it was because of his accomplishments. His achievements would be the language my fraternity uses, because that's our motto: achievement in every field of human endeavor. So we today, we have to actually confront our own elitism, us with degrees, right? And we try to dismiss or shame those who may not be as learned as us with, alphabets before or after our names. But if we're being quite frank, much of the work is being done by lay people, by people outside of the academy. And Schomburg is an embodiment, of that work. Now, what would you say that Arturo's legacy is to people creating private collections? I often say, and this is very true, my mother's living room is basically a living museum of Afrocentricity and family history. Artifacts representing our African lineage, some representing our Filipino lineage. So there's some some Asian artifacts to reflect that, because they're Spanish-speaking Asians, because people get confused. It's an Asian man that's named Ernesto Hernandez, but he's Asian. Yes, that's because of what we've already discussed, the Spanish Empire, right? And then family photographs and stuff. And something that we've been doing the last several ASALH conferences is training people how to use family history and family artifacts to create basically living room museums or living room archives, for lack of a better way to put it. So I'm just curious on, your take of Arturo's contribution to that and his pioneering of that.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing thing, because we're having a moment where the conversations about archives, right, it feels like it's having a real moment, right? I.e., and people, when they think about archive theory and they think of like Jacques Derrida and they think about, and I'm like, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about again, the preservation of our own histories. And we're talking about who are the stewards for that history, right? And, you know, I think that, first of all, you know, there's an African proverb, right, that talks about, and forgive me for not knowing what region of Africa, but this idea of, you know, when an elder passes, right, the libraries that pass, right, the idea of like, our elders are our first archives, right? If we are blessed to get to know our grandparents, if we are blessed to know, you know, those great aunts and uncles, that's the first step. The second step is, you know, what technology has wrought with our phones is, you know, the flip side of that is we no longer have written letters, right? Unless people are printing out their emails. We no longer have, you know, photographs, Kodaks, right? Unless people print out from their phones. And so there is a sense of technology has wrought our lives easier in some ways, but there's also ways in which our digital footprints may not maintain, right, evidences that we need, right? So, you know, I think we in this generation are curating all the time, and we don't think about it, right? And I say this generation, I don't mean 18 to 24. I mean, you know, everybody uses Facebook now. Every time you put a photograph, the decision to put that specific photo up, the decision to highlight that specific moment in your life, you are curating something. That is an exhibition, right? Instagram, TikTok, we're all doing it constantly. We just don't use that language, which is interesting. So I think that as much as we can, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I live near the Schomburg Center and have for several years now. And I went there recently, and there was I went to his collection of photographs, right? That's in the photographs and prints division. And I came across photographs I hadn't seen when I was writing the book. And I said, hey, wait a minute, where'd y'all get these from? And they said that there had been an envelope of photos that had been attributed to Lawrence Reddick, who was the curator after Arturo Schomburg passed away, of what was colloquially known as the Schomburg collection, right? It was the collection of stuff that he had given. I mentioned it as the Negro collection of history, literature, and prints. And they just, you know, I don't know if they just left it one day on somebody's desk. And so there's these pictures of Arturo Schomburg, right? From the 1920s and 30s. That is the value of just, you know, looking in closets, and, you know, people are holding on to things. And it is a beautiful thing it's beautiful to know that families across this country are know that we have contributed to this country, and understand that if a textbook does not include that person, for example, well, we can do, right? We can honor our ancestors, and we can do, I love that idea of the living room museum, right? Because that too is as valid, right? As that which, you know, the museums that are on some of the fanciest streets in this country.
Indeed, indeed. All right, we got a couple questions in the chat. One says, and as you mentioned, the Schomburg joined the Freemason Lodge known as El Sol, the Cuba Lodge, that joined the Revolutionary Committee of Puerto Rico, and that he was part of the political club known as Las Dos Antillas. And then the questioner says, to my knowledge, these groups supported Cuban and Puerto Rican independence movements, as you stated. His question is, what was Schomburg's role within these groups when it comes to supporting these independence movements?
So he was the secretary. So you have in these group, you know, in these clubs, you had, you know, president, the vice president, whatever. He was the club secretary of Las Dos Antillas, right? Meaning he was taking notes. El Sol de Cuba, that Freemason lodge, he was initiated into that lodge. That lodge then gets renamed as, so that you can tell by the language, right? That was a Spanish-speaking lodge in Brooklyn, New York. He is initiated into it by Spanish-speaking brothers. And those folks then move on. Like him, many get married to African-American women, right? They start living in an English space, right? But they also move. And so what you had was El Sol de Cuba Lodge becomes the Prince Hall Mason Lodge, I believe 22 from Brooklyn, because you had more English speaking folks coming both from the US South and the British colonies at the time. And so he rises up actually to, at one point, he heads up, he's one of the highest members in the state of New York. And so he remains, he is an initiate who remains deeply active in the Prince Hall Masons for the entirety of his life. And prior to the selling of his collection in 1926, he was most famous within Prince Hall Mason circles. And so, again, when people think about the Prince Hall Masons, for those who don't know, you were just speaking about Kappas, right? When we talk about these organizations, these fraternities, these sororities, these secret societies, right? These, again, are transnational organizations, right? So you have chapters across this hemisphere. And so you have people like writing, right? And speaking different languages, traveling, coming, sharing with each other. And so, no, he's also an elk, right? He's deeply involved involved in different lodges. He's so there. I mean, there's so many books to be written about Arturo Schomburg, right? I mean, in the same way, like if you just had a book about like Kappa history, right? And put all these, that's something that you all need to remember, right? You all memorize, right? Who was initiated when, what line, what year, right? But the world in general doesn't know that, right? And so, there are books to be written about these organizations, right? That's why I made mention of the networks with regards to the collecting of books. Books to be written to really understand, right? Really foreground how deeply important community was. Nobody was acting by themselves, right? They couldn't survive in this segregated country. And again, the United States was not the only segregated country, right? Like this entire hemisphere, like people are segregated by where they could live, where they could go to school, who they could sleep with, maybe not sleep with, but who they could marry, like all of those things. Where could they own lands? Could they own property in general? All of that is segregated throughout this hemisphere. And so, no, he was deeply invested in the Prince Hall Masons, deeply invested in these revolutionary clubs. And whether he had, in both of those instances, he had formal titles, but he was always, always, always giving back. The other part of the correspondence that's really interesting is you see how many requests came to him, right? You were talking about public history. Some lady who was like in Idaho, for example, who wanted to donate, here's $2, I hope that you can buy, recover something, right? But put this towards a pamphlet. I mean, people coming to ask him across the country to come talk, always. And so that's a way, right? It's not just, yes, he was doing exhibitions at the YMCA and the library, but he was always giving talks. And the PhDs wanted him to write books. The PhDs were like, no, you need to do this. And he was writing in the Crisis, and he was writing for Opportunity Journal, and he was writing for Garvey's newspaper as well, for the Negro World. My argument in my book is that he is very conscious of accessibility and the accessibility of knowledge and sharing the knowledge and creating that. Again, an educated population is one that understands that they have a role to play in the democracy. Right. And again, that is also something that is not inherent to the United States. That is, Black peoples across this hemisphere have fought for that.
Indeed. And for those that don't know, Prince Hall was a founder of what became known as the African Lodge, and is attributed as the creation of modern Black Freemasonry, and they are often referred to, and they adopted the formal name of the Prince Hall Lodges and the Prince Hall Freemasonry, for those who may not be aware of that. And it's important because we live in the age of renewed conspiracy theories, and I have to remind my students that many of our Black towns were founded by Black churches and Black Freemason lodges. And it's just a shame that we've allowed, be honest with you, white supremacists who are dealing with their own issues, the John Birch Society and others, the militia movements, to create these conspiracies about these organizations. And many young Black folk from my era, I graduated high school in '93, so it was a big deal in hip hop and everything when I was an undergrad about the Illuminati and all this stuff, where we began to disparage the people that founded, the Black people that found, and brown people that founded our communities and made it possible for us to live and perpetuate our cultures and families. It's just a shame that that has happened, and I just want to point that out. So someone is a kind of a change of shift, but it's related to what we have been talking about. Would you say that we should print the pictures of our photos to keep that living room archive and grow it in our families and keep our family history and heritage that way? I'm going to say yes, but what do you think, Dr. Valdés?
No, I think so. I mean, I think, again, we don't think about, it's interesting, right? Because we are in a moment when we think about technology and conversations about technology and the algorithm and, you know, I mean, every single day, just by which swipe, what we choose to amplify, right? There's somebody buying that data, right? Yeah. We know that there are whole organizations that are buying that data. And Lord knows what's going to come of that, right? But when it comes to the sharing of our histories, right? I mean, you know, I'm a little bit younger than you, but not by much, by like a couple of years there. You know, when I was growing up, you know, there was more of a presence of grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles, and we're losing that, right? We see in this day and age, like, and we see even something, again, it's very interesting to me. That's another book to be written about, like, what progress means and what modernity means, right? And so, you know, the idea of, there was a time in this country until very recently where there were at most, well, there were first 3 channels on the television, and at most there came a point where there was about, you know, 20, right? Now we have all of these streaming services, right? And what that means is we are losing collective experiences, yes. Right? And so you have, you know, those moments where Game of Thrones becomes a conversation, or, you know, where Abbott Elementary becomes a conversation, or, you know, those are just because they want to be able to watch something together, talk to each other. You know, we as a country, there used to be more moments like that. You see remnants of it with the Super Bowl, right? Like, that's like a moment, right? But depending on who's singing, and then, like, depending on the halftime show, and who's playing. But so yeah, it's interesting to me because not everything is zero-sum game. Not everything is what is gained and what is lost. But I think sometimes, right, that we need to step back and check and go, you know, where are our stories going? Who's recording them? You know, I mean, there are things that are on YouTube. This will survive on YouTube, but, you know, that there's somebody who, you know, you talk to the right person, they'll remember what your great used to cook for breakfast. And there are things like that. And, you know, many of us also grew up in families that didn't pass on just because the families just didn't, you know, they didn't think that it was worthy of passing on. You know, I have family that, you know, I know my grandparents, my great grandparents didn't have formal education or got just to a certain level. And so they were like, no, they didn't see the value in those stories. Indeed. Right. And I think it's always up to a certain generation to look back, right, and sit down with our elders, or sit down. And elders doesn't have to be 80, 90 years old. If you may not know someone who's that old, right? You know, if you're 20, like, God knows, somebody who's in their 40s is like an elder.
We the OGs now. They call me Unc when I go back to the neighborhood. Now I'm Unc.
Right. I mean, anytime like somebody wants to like be cute and they're like, and I was like, don't do that. I have two nieces. I have a niece and two nephews. They're the only people that can call me auntie. Don't come at me like that. But it is important to share that histories and share those things, because again, we're the ones that are preserving it, and we can be living memories. It's not just, yes, printing out the photos and, writing down the histories. Yes. And sharing the stories, right? Yeah. That's important, and making sure our kids know those stories. I know that that's going into like the next question about, younger generations. Yes. Mm-hmm. Those conversations all of these conversations are deeply important, because what we have when we don't have these conversations is every generation thinking that they're Columbus and discovering these things, right? So for example, when we talk about Black Latin American history, right, that has never been central to any curriculum in this hemisphere. None, right? What we are seeing in this country right now is you're starting to see, like, even the word Latinx and that whole conversation, right? That Black history, like, let me be very, very clear about this. The country that has done the most to emphasize Black history is the United States, right? Yes. In this hemisphere, because even when you talk about, well, what about Jamaicans? What about Haitians? What about, right? There are national heroes, and yet there are still remnants of imperialist modes, as there are here in the United States. And I will use this as an example. It's a controversial example. Bear with me. 1619, right? That year, it's one that is talking about the foundation of something under an English empire.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it's leaving out too much of the story. It is Anglo-centered. It's ignoring at least 100 years of Black folk who came to the Americas, who came to what is now the continental USA under Spanish and Portuguese crown. That has been my major criticism. I'm like, so you're going to ignore Florida? You just going to ignore it. You're just going to ignore all of it.
And that's right. And so for anyone, right, but we need to have space for that, right? We need to have space to understand that. And it's not to say that one empire is better than the other. It is not. It is to say that if we start history, and all of us know about 1492, right? Yeah. We just had a holiday that was commemorating that moment. So we go 1492, 1619. Exactly. As if nothing, and that literally is more than a century of Black life, Black and Indigenous life, that it wasn't just genocide, right? Like people, and there were free Black peoples that were coming in that time, in addition to those that had been trafficked and enslaved. So, but when I say that to people stop, and it's not to say, look, I take no issue with the project. It is important, right? I have the 1619 book is right up there, but it is also, as someone who specializes in and is invested in, right? Hey, but what about these histories that are written in Spanish and written in Portuguese and that are intersecting with English and that are intersecting with French, right? I want a more whole rendering of our histories. And so I'm doing my small part in making sure that happens.
Indeed, and I concur, because one of my teaching fields, and I had to take comps on it, was slaveries and slave trades, internal slaveries and slave trades in Africa, and then the transatlantic slave trade and the trans-Saharan slave trade, right? At Michigan State, studying under Africanists and people like Walter Hawthorne, Gwendolyn Mildor Hall, and others, right? And I'm like, man, to start it there is ignoring the Iberians. So we're ignoring, and one of my colleagues, Dr. Robert Kleins, is watching us, and he does medieval European history on. So we're ignoring, the free Blacks that converted to Catholicism, not as a result of the slave trade coming out of the Congo, so we're going to ignore, those early folks that came to what is now today Cuba and Brazil, in Puerto Rico. Like we're going to ignore Florida and parts of what we would now call, the Delta, Miami. I mean, not Miami, Mississippi.
Mississippi and all that. Yeah, the Gulf.
And like we're going to ignore all of that and their contributions. We're going to ignore, the first enslaved Africans and the first outside of maybe the handful that maybe came over and what Ivan Van Sertima talks about, just a handful. They didn't bring civilization to the indigenous people. They was already had their own civilizations. That is another issue I always got to fight back against. But those first free black African travelers and migrants, we're gonna ignore all that. And that's also one of my issues with the documentary that caught a lot of steam, 13. And I'm like, so we're going to skip, we're just going to just ignore convict leasing. Right? The foundation of what I would call mass incarceration and all that after slavery. It just jumped straight from the 13th Amendment to the 1970s. I'm like, you can't do that with history, So I often have to use that documentary and then Slavery by Another Name to help my students get a full.
Right, I think, I love, again, it's interesting to me because it's recognizing it's not zero sum, right? Understanding, okay, this has a purpose, right? Because guess what? There are people who have never thought about US history as centering African-American history, right? And that's what 1619 Project did. That's why you saw that blowback, right? That's why you saw like that reaction, because this challenged how they think about this country, right? And if they were conversant in Black intellectuals, again, of all, like from all the different spaces, right, who talk about, no, James Baldwin saying, I love this, therefore I'm going to criticize it. I love this country, therefore I have the right to criticize it because we are, in efforts to make it a more perfect union. I'm going to put in the chat this website called firstblacks.org, which people would be shocked about. That is a space it's a website that's created by the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute, because the center, when Columbus comes, he does not touch the continental United States, right?
Exactly.
What he touches are the islands. And so the islands that today encompasses the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? The indigenous name of that island is Haiti, which is like when I challenge folks to be like, understand that's an indigenous name, right? Yeah. That means lands of mountains. So when those Black revolutionaries of the 18th century renamed their islands using the indigenous name, right? That in and of itself is Afro-indigeneity, right? Yeah. Which people don't, there is a deep investment in that by the fighters on that island. But that is talking about, again, folks who landed on that island. That was when the Spanish came. They call it Little Spanish Islands, i.e. La Española becomes Hispaniola. That it shows the archival, the documentation, both of when the Spanish crown allows for the direct trafficking from the African continent to the Iberian Peninsula, and then from the African continent directly to the Caribbean. And so you see the progression of what would become the transatlantic slave trade. But it is a phenomenal resource that not enough people know, which is why I talk about it. Yeah, I mean, it is, we could do this. Sorry, I see Dr. Bess is in the house too. Hi, Dr. Bess, I say as someone who is in the CLA. And thanks you for your work and all that you've done, but that was directed at you.
I know. I was down there in Montgomery, yeah. So yeah, but no, indeed, and once again, yeah, thank you, Brother Best. And the irony, not to get sidetracked, but I do want to mention this because we just had Columbus Day, Indigenous American Day for those who are trying to decolonize and all that. It's ironic because, the pushback some people give is, well, it's American history. It's not American history, right? It is actually Iberian American history, if you want to put it that way. As you said, he never reached the continental USA, none of that, right? And the promotion of Columbus as a national hero is a 20th century manifestation of Italian American immigrants. Like, but people don't know history, so they like, and it gets so frustrating.
Well, but here's where the opportunity also is. So silencing the past for the historians in the room. If you do not know Michel Wolfe-Touillot's Silencing the Past, he has a chapter on how Columbus Day becomes Columbus Day, right? And it is essentially, it is how do we create history, right? And I'm sure like those of, you know, the participants in the public history track, right? Not only is it, we're constantly curating, we're constantly selecting which thing is worthy of an article, a book, an exhibition, a poster, whatever we do. And so in that selection, we necessarily make a decision about what we focus on and what gets lost, right? And so for me, you know, when I'm speaking to Latin American audiences or talking about Afro-Latin American history, you know, we got to delve into like the, you know, the point that I make about the African diaspora is when I was a college student, you know, it's the same observation I made about how people were using the word Caribbean, right? Because depending on who you're talking to, you're almost never talking about the entirety of that space, right? You are almost always either referencing the remnants of empire. So Jamaica, Barbados, that crew, maybe Haiti, almost never Martinique and Guadeloupe as departments of France, right? Maybe Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the DR, right? But almost never the entirety of the thing. And so it's the same thing when I saw with African diaspora, that phrase where 20 years ago, when I was a college student, you know, thinking about what I was noticing, okay, well, who's covered under that, right? So almost always English speaking, right? So it's always the United States and the continent, right? So there's the continent and then the diaspora. Okay, cool. US, and see a lot of comparison, US, South Africa, Ghana, right? So we understand that because of the politics of what was happening at the time, right? Haiti, so it was like, okay, so we have no issue with English speaking, we have no issue with French speaking, right? The issue comes with Spanish and Portuguese.
Yes.
The issue comes with an empire that won this idea of, oh, well, it wasn't the same kind of slavery, right? Stop it. Like, yes, it was. Because it was, and not only what, it was just that, again, the documentation that survives here in this country, there is also corresponding documentation. It is just in Sao Tome and Príncipe. It is just in Sevilla, Spain. It is in the archives. We just don't have enough people who are studying Spanish, who are interested in Black lives in those countries, right? Indeed. Because that work is waiting to be done, right?
Do you think that part of the issue is a lot of the post-colonial and in some places post-revolutionary project has been to try to silence talk about race and racialization? I think that Latin America has been the nation building project whereby race was elided was really effective, right? In Latin America. I think what you see, you've always had Black activists in those countries, right? So, and I'm talking historically, right? This is not a 20th, 21st century phenomenon because, again, you had free Black populations, you had enslaved populations. So you had, you know, conversations about class in those spaces, conversations about education, conversations about access to the press, access to means of communication throughout this hemisphere. What you had more effective, what you didn't have in Latin America was Black populations creating colleges, as opposed to in the United States, right? So that's a huge difference, right? Because if you take that infrastructure out, think about the work that HBCUs specifically do, and the organizations like, you know, the Divine Nine, and like all of these other organizations, right?
Some of them were there, right? So you had Garveyites, right, in Latin America. Of course, you had vibrant chapters in Latin America. But take like the college piece, which again, people forget that the colleges at HBCUs were sometimes primarily funded by white philanthropists in the post-Civil War era.
Yes, ma'am.
So you had a class of white folks who had fought for abolition, and their descendants, right, who were invested in, okay, wait, as a whole people, the African-American population also needs to be educated. And so you did have like folks coming from Cuba who were going to Tuskegee, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
But you don't have that similar class in Latin America. And so what you don't have is that educational space widespread. And so again, this is where social media has played a huge role, right, in the last 20 years. But it is astounding to think about, again, there's so much to be done. I hope that the reason that I speak the way I speak, in terms of my energy, is this: I'm incredibly impassioned by what our ancestors were able to accomplish, given the circumstances under which they lived. It's something that I keep front and center. Sometimes folks in the academy, we get, oh, well,
yes, I know, sister, I know.
Right. So sometimes like we get annoyed and we have to remember, like, wait a minute. Particularly for those of us who are descended from enslaved peoples, right? Yeah. Those of us who can look at documents. I've been in an archive in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and seen my family tree and been like, oh, washerwoman, shoe repair, like I know who I come from and where I come from. And for them, so many of us can say that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams, right? Yeah. We are the embodiment of the prayers that they didn't even know that they were praying. And now what is our responsibility with that, right? And so for me, what's deeply important, again, is confronting the hurt and the pain of the Spanish Empire and their heritage of the denial of Blackness that we then see as foundational in the construction of Latin American and Latinx identity, such that people can look at me like, when I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, for the 7 years I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, I was a light-skinned Black woman. Guess what? Racially, I am a light-skinned Black woman, right? Like, if you don't know my name and you look at me, you're like, hey, you look like my mama, my auntie, blah, 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 blah. I was cool with that because I know who I am. But there are so many people who look like this who I'm not Black. Mm-hmm. And that right there, the pain that comes, the millions of people that have caused that hurt right there, the denial of Blackness in order to approximate whiteness. That's the legacy. That is the living legacy of the Spanish Empire. And that's the pain that we see.
Indeed. And I experienced that when I lived in Dade County, Florida, and I was managing the McDonald's. And I was the midnight shift manager. So I had a lot of Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who worked for me. And, the Puerto Ricans, I was their brother. You know what I'm saying? I was, they viewed me as a younger man, so they would call me Papito. They brothers, some of them was really dark skinned, some of them were really light skinned, but they was like, no, we Puerto Rican, we Black. The Dominicans, they would always say, no Negro, no Negro.
Right.
I'm like, bro, but we look exactly the same. Like, look in the mirror. I'm like, come on, man, look, we are. And it used to hurt me because I was like, man, but yeah, exactly, in that pain. But we're seeing an awakening through Black studies, and I guess to pivot. So I got a two-part. First a statement, and then a question for you. But we're seeing in places like Brazil and in Puerto Rico, which is part of the U.S. as we identify, and in other places where Black studies or Afro Latino studies is rising, and students at every level are demanding it. And things of that nature, which is exciting for us in the field. How do you feel about, in Black studies, Africana studies, however people want to use the nomenclature, how has the study of Afro-Latinos been received in your experience, and what is the potential for it in our field?
I think it's interesting because I will say, so what you just said about Dominicans versus Puerto Ricans is interesting because this is in direct relation to me answering your question. The study of the context of those two islands is deeply important, right? So for people go, hey, but we look, yeah, but Dominicans have a history with Haiti, right? And so understanding, and particularly in Dade County, that space, right, is a particular one, right? Because, South Florida has, since the Cuban Revolution, right, there has been a particular portrait of a Cuban population that erases the Afro-Cubans that are also there, right? And so there's a history of that space that erases the Barbadians, that erases the folks from the Bahamas, that erases all of those islands that come into that space. Dominicans in Haiti, like the Dominican Republic in Haiti, is a fraught relationship. And one has to understand that, and also understand that Dominicans, until very recently, did not have a choice on their census to check off Black, right? They were Indio, all of them, right? It was, you were either a light-skinned Indio, i.e. indigenous, you were dark-skinned, right? And that was a change in census, right? So we think about certain tools or certain implements or certain parts of our society where we sometimes don't correlate the relationship. The ability to check off a box, right, is sometimes emblematic of an identity or can create an identity, right? So Latino doesn't exist anywhere other than in the United States. Latino, Latina, Latinx, whatever word, it doesn't exist outside the United States. In these other countries, you are Colombian, Panamanian, but you are that national identity, right? Yeah. So thinking about that, thinking about a census, thinking about the fact that Mexico just included a space for Afro-Mexicans, and they were like, oh, they're something like more than 1 million people who identify as that, who have lived that reality. Because at one point in the 16th century, Mexico was the space that had the highest number of Africans and their descendants, but people don't know that history. So for me, when I am looking at, I was trained as a comparatist. I have an undergraduate degree in English. And so, US lit, but also, British lit, but really US lit. That's how I did my English degree. And then my advanced degrees are in Spanish and Portuguese. And so what that meant was when I came into that PhD program, I wasn't trained like everybody else, right? So I wasn't trained in Sor Juana and Cervantes and, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez and all these people, right? I'm trained in Toni Morrison and Richard Wright and James Baldwin. And then at my penultimate semester, I started being trained in Afro-Hispanic authors, i.e. Spanish-speaking, Spanish-writing authors, writing in Cuba and Panama and the Caribbean, and who are saying unequivocally, I am Black. And they're saying, yo soy negra, no kind of no hiding behind anything. And that intrigued me. And so I was like, wait a minute, this is the same, right? You have this declaration of Black pride in Spanish and in Portuguese and in English. So I come into that program already comparing, and then I get formally trained as a comparatist and get formally trained as a hemispheric person. So for me, I see the world both in wide lens, right? I see it hemispherically and I can zoom in, right? And so that's why it's deeply important to me to go, yes, Arturo Schomburg, Harlem Renaissance. And When the Negro Digs Up His Past, which is his most famous essay, is published in the Survey graphic issue that then goes on to be the New Negro Anthology, edited by Elaine Locke, the other PhD we've not mentioned in this moment. Arturo Schomburg was 51 years old. So I wanted to know who the man was prior to that, right? Yeah. That's why that book comes out of that simple question, right? Here's somebody at their most famous moment. They're there, but who were they before that? Indeed. Right? Who were their parents? What did they live? How did they speak? What all of the interests? That's what got me into that space. I will tell you the reception of my work is divergent within an African-American population. And Dr. Bess, I will say, I have said this always, the most supportive professional organization for me as someone who does this work has been College Language Association.
Awesome.
Always, right? It is Black organizations that to me have been the most supportive. Oh, it is the reason why I am going to shout out in Asala. I am going to shout out CLA Journal. I am going to shout out Kalalu, right? Because none of us, if you are trained in a certain space, you are not trained to look at Black organizations. You're not trained to look at the intellectual work that has been produced for more than a century in this country. So within African-American context, as my favorite comment about my work is an older woman came up to me and said, you a Trojan horse, huh? And I was like, how's that? She's, we think we know what you're gonna say. And then you open your mouth. And I go, yeah, well, yes. Because we gotta call out these things, right? So, you know, if I'm within a Latino, Latinx, Latinx audience, and I'm the darkest person in the room, there is an issue. And I will call that out, right? And that is what, you know, we have to talk about the colorism in our communities. And I challenge my colleagues to say, who are you identifying as brilliant in your classrooms? Because if it's just a question of, oh, they look like me, no, we have to do better than that. We have to be better than that, right? Because we have to acknowledge that knowledge and brilliance comes in all forms. And so, you know, as educators, we have to challenge our own biases. It has to be part of it for me, so that we can produce, we can empower those that are coming behind us to produce the work that is more interesting, that reflects that diversity of experience. And it's you know, I will continue to do that. So yeah, African-American population, Black populations, yes. Latinx populations, because and so the majority of I get more, I will say that during the time of the year, I'm popular during Black History Month, less popular during Latino history, Latinx, Hispanic Heritage Month. But, you know, again, Arturo Schomburg, and speaking about him, you know, he continues to open the roads for me.
That's good. And then as you can see, more and more people trying to do the good work. That's one of my approaches with our webinar series is I try to do those intersections for each Heritage Month, you know. So now, although this one is right after the end of Latinx or Hispanic Heritage Month, but it's part of that, you know, and then in November, we're going to do one with intersections for Native American Heritage Month. So I try to create. Last year, we did it on the Young Lords and the Black Panther Party, you know. So I try to do those. Because that's what the field does. That's what the field does do for many of us, and that's what it was designed to do. You know, it's not supposed to be solely an African American centered project. That's for some it may have started that way, but I disagree that it started that way. When I look back at San Francisco State, look back at places like Northwestern, Brooklyn College, Crane College, which is now Malcolm X College in Chicago. It didn't start that way, but some people, some of them are luminaries. They try to shape it that way, but you know, I reject that, and many of us do reject it. It's supposed to be a holistic diasporic approach. What I would love to see is more work done on African descendants in the Asian world.
Yes. Look you were talking about Filipino heritage, right? And so, you know, I was just reading Anthony Ocampo, who wrote a book called Latinos of Asia, right? Talking about the Philippines. Yeah, I mean, when I say that there is so much work, for those of you who ever have the opportunity again to come to New York, besides going to the Strand, please come to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, New York, because again, the work that has yet to be done. And again, when we think about it's sad because I think that people think of, you know, they think of the US military. Sometimes when they think about Afro-Asian, they think of the Vietnam War and they think about soldiers. And and they don't think about like they definitely don't center the African continent, right?
Yeah.
And those migrations, as you just were mentioning, are just the different trades that were happening. And I think sometimes for me, I get excited about all history that has not yet been written, but we know humans have lived this, right? So, you know, I'm excited when there are populations of people that people don't know about, i.e., you know, a Japanese population, you know, the Japanese population in Lima, Peru, right? When we think about Latin American studies and this idea of mestizaje, right? This, no, we're three races, we're indigenous and European and African. And I go, okay, so we're leaving out Asian completely, right? And so Asian history, not only Asian American, but I mean, broad Asian American, right? Like the hemispheric Asian presence, right? Yeah. Deeply important, right? But Asian populations throughout, right? These spaces, you know, I mean, I think as a child, not as a child, I remember when Mississippi Masala came out, right? That movie. And to have that protagonist's father talking about his life in Kenya, right? And he is an Indian protagonist and they're in Mississippi, right? That right there, I said, you see that? Where do we get that kind of history? Because immediately, if you're watching, you know, what the frig were the Indians doing in Kenya? What do you mean? And Uganda, like, what are we talking about? When did that happen, right? All of this, a lot of it is all labor, right? And we know, and I would like to see, you know, more of a consciousness of that, a grounding of an understanding in, you know, labor, right? And the idea of like, well, we need to get a source of free labor wherever it comes from. And we want to replace this population with this population. And yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to be done for those of you who are watching, both on this live moment and YouTube. There's so much.
Indeed, indeed. And most people would regulate that simply to the British Empire, right? But you see it in the Portuguese Empire as well, with the movements of Africans to Asia, and in some cases Asians to different parts of Africa, and then to the Americas. I mean, yes, it's so much. It's so much work to do, but we can't be narrow. And that's one of the things I think is exciting with like the work that you're doing and work that others are doing, where we're pushing the boundaries to new heights of what is Black studies, what is Africana studies. You know, and the generation that we're training and the generations that follow us, I think they will be in the great positions to expand and carry it further. Because I remember when I was an undergraduate and I earned a bachelor's degree in African American studies, I remember how classmates were shocked when I did my project in the African diaspora class. I did it on Guyana, right? And they were shocked because, you know, most of them were doing it like on Black folks in Canada, and, you know, Africans in the UK. And I'm like, and then of course the generic one that, you know, when they were trying to expand their thing, you know, was Brazil, right? You know, and I'm like, and those are all fine and those are all important, but I'm like, man, you know, there's Costa Rica, Panama, you know. I mean, I remember watching on the news and watching how peculiar the language was used towards Manuel Noriega, where they were saying the Afro-Panamanian dictator. I'm like, that's peculiar that they are emphasizing it with him, but every other time they talk about Panamanians, they just saying Panamanians, but the media is emphasizing this, you know, and those type of peculiarities and things of that nature. So I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing and encourage you to continue. And I know your students are very fortunate to have you there and training them and whatnot. So what brought you to Black studies? You said you started with literature and then moved to language studies. So what brought you to Black studies?
So I had always been within my doctoral program, I was always focused on race and gender, always. So, you know, if we're gonna talk, I have to take my early modern Spanish drama class. I'm looking at, oh, really? Sor Juana is representing Black speech in 17th century Mexico? Huh? That's what drew me. And I will say that the pivot for me, the key moment. So when I was in college, I remember the first African-American literature class I took. And it was ironic. My first year of college, I didn't speak in college because I was really scared. My sophomore year, I took African-American literature. And ironically, we had lecture and we had discussion section. And this particular discussion section, and to this point, I didn't speak, and this kind of sounds apocryphal, but this is how I remember it. We were talking about double consciousness. And my predominantly white classmates did not understand this concept, right? This idea of, what do you mean that someone, you know who you are, and then someone outside of you is judging you based on how you look, and you are conscious of the two things at the same time? They could not understand this concept. And that for me, like that was like, yep, that was my existence at my college. So that was like click, click. And then when I, so taking African-American lit, and then when I took Latino literature at the time and Afro-Hispanic literature, again, seeing this unequivocal acceptance of Blackness, that was like, hey, and that was what pivoted me to going into that Spanish and Portuguese program. That professor was a visiting professor who encouraged me to apply to that program. And then the way that he taught was that literature was deeply founded in history, right? You have to understand the context. And so I get to Vanderbilt, and an advisor said, what do you want to specialize in, Spain or Latin America? And I wanted to do the Caribbean, so I said Latin America. So, okay, you have to do Brazil. Sure. Because at the time, I was very young when I started, and I was like, I'm gonna get my master's degree and I'm gonna go to law school, because this whole like PhD thing, like who's doing that? Like that's 7 years. I'm not, whatever. And I'm first gen, doctor, lawyer is what's recognized. That's what's legible. And so I went into a Portuguese class, and that Portuguese professor was a woman from Rio de Janeiro. And the way that she was talking her Portuguese, for whatever reason, it sounded like my family's Puerto Rican Spanish. And so I was like, wait. And that was, I said, well, what do these two spaces have in common? Black people. And that was where, if I took a philology, I took a Spanish philology course, and I was focusing on African contributions to Spanish. If I, like every single class I took, I would flip it to always focus on Blackness. Yeah. And I was thankful to not be scared of, when I took seminars and they would talk about, the boom. I was a person, because I wasn't invested in getting, I didn't think I was going to be a professor, right? I really didn't. I was just, what kept me in graduate school was my curiosity and what I was learning. But I wasn't afraid to say, this is racist and this is misogynist, and, for all of these esteemed texts. So, sometimes when students come from different backgrounds, and they're, we were touching on the elitism of the academy, there's value in being trained in different ways. There's value in people coming from different spaces and feeling free to not, when they don't worship the sacred cows, they're just gonna say, nope, this, I disagree. And you may say, no, but what they're doing with language, I don't care. I care about the representation of the peoples that they're including here. And so that's how it came to be, is that I was focused, and this is happening at the same time that I'm recovering my own family history, where I come from a family that was racially mixed, but they're in Puerto Rico and they never talked about race. And so, again, I spoke about going to the archive and being like, hey, wait a minute, this family, my mother's family has been on that island since at least the 1820s, not too far away from San Juan, quite frankly. And so, both of those things kind of collided for me. And so when I graduated with my doctorate, I said, well, my first book is going to be my calling card, as it is, right? Well, monograph. My first book is not Diasporic Blackness. My first book, or my first monograph rather, is a look at the representations of African diasporic religions in these literatures. And so it's looking at candomblé, looking at Santeria in Brazil and in Cuba and here in the United States, to say, hey, there's an invocation of these religious systems and throughout the hemisphere, because what happened as I was studying was, hey, I'm seeing these motifs, they're all happening at the same, I'm seeing, you know, that the motif of the, you know, those that can fly back to the continent, right? Or, you know, oh, and I started really honing in on invocation of entities across the hemisphere. So, you know, the invocation of Oshun, the invocation of Shango, across language systems. And so that really was, so for me, what I came to articulate is that, you know, my Latinx, my own personal Latinx identity and my identity as a researcher is foundationally like grounded in Blackness and Black peoples and Black histories. And it is the recovery of that, of those histories, that is deeply important to me. And so the work that I write is, you know, I organized a conference in 2010. Those were actually my first two books, was a conference proceedings and a edited collection of essays, because I wanted to know who else was doing the work. And I wanted to gather them, and I wanted to broaden the definition of African diaspora to include Spanish and Portuguese. And so I did that. Then that monograph. Then Mr. Schomburg is the big fish, and he was the unknown fish in Afro-Latin American studies. And so I live near the Schomburg Center, and I said, well, let's see what we can find. And I started just nominally, you know, I knew the perception of him was within Spanish-speaking populations was that he had betrayed the Puerto Rican population. He had turned his back and embraced the African-American population. And within an African-American population, there was an erasure that he was born on the islands.
Yes.
Right? And so there's erasure happening in both senses.
Yes,
and so for me, you know, it was deeply important again to in my mind to just recover, like, wait a minute, but what was this man? Who was this man? And what did he live in? What was the context in which he lived? And so that's why, you know, this is not a strict intellectual biography. This is not, he woke up this day, he wore this, he ran into this person, that's not what this is. This is my rendering of understanding what that moment was and how he lived, right? So explaining who the Prince Hall Masons are and the origins of the Prince Hall Masons, explaining who Rafael Serra is or Jose Marti, because what I realized about my work, I want my work to reach different audiences with but I have an awareness that people are coming at it with what they're coming at it, right? So if all you know about Oshun is that she appeared, or I forgot, well, I'll say Oshun, and or the Orishas, let's say, is that Audre Lorde wrote a poem about the Orishas in 1968. And please come to this party and you'll open up and realize, oh, there's an Afro-Cuban woman named Nancy Morejon who is also writing about the Orishas. There's a Brazilian woman named Conceição Evaristo, and she's writing about the Orishas, right? So all of my work are a buffet, right? It is, I want people to come from different spaces and pick it up and go, oh, I didn't know that. Oh, there's that connection. Indeed. And that's deliberate on my part. It's how I design my work, because it is also me reflecting, like, here are the puzzle pieces. We just need to do this. And my books are an attempt to do that.
Indeed. Well, they're doing a good job, and I really enjoyed your Diasporic Blackness. Indeed, you're doing a really, really good job. Now, someone had one last question. I'm going to ask them to retype it or restate it, because I'm not clear on what it is. And the question was, where it's in the Q&A, where could I get the Black studies of a specific country? Now, I'm not sure if they're asking, how can I find out and learn about Black populations, Black cultures of a specific country, or if they're asking about a Black studies curriculum, or how they're approaching Black studies in their institutions. So if the person who asked that, if you could clarify that question, that'd be helpful. But as we wrap up, I have one last question. If you had to give advice to a young person right now, an undergraduate who say, hey, I'm interested in doing this type of work with Afro Latinos, and I would love to do it within a Black studies context, what advice would you give them? I know it's tough. I saved it for last.
Yeah, no, it's good because, so one thing I would say was if they want to do formal academic work, i.e. I want to go and get a degree in some things. What I would say is look at the books that you're attracted to, look at the books that, look at the articles and pay attention to who's writing that work. And then go see where they're at. Go see what universities they're at. Thank you, Dr. Bess. I'm gonna try to be there in Atlanta. We're trying to, I just got an invitation to go to Emory in April. And so go see who's writing the work, what universities they're a part of, and then go look up, are they by themselves in that university, or are there other people, right, supporting that work? Because I think that for young people, they don't know that you don't need people to be doing exactly what you want, but man, do they have to have the predisposition to like fold in that way. So for example, I have students who, I had a student who wanted to do an independent study on racial disparities in the medical profession, right? I'm not a medical humanist, right? But I'm like, yes, let's go do that, right? Because ultimately, depending on where you're at, depending on the college, many of us necessarily become generalists, right? We are trained as specialists, but then just due to the institutions that we're at, we become generalists. And so, I may not be able to say, oh, okay, that's not my specialty, but yeah, can I direct you to a Dorothy Roberts or a Deidre Cooper Owens? Or yes, I can, because one necessarily has to, have to, but again, I'm a curious person. And then I would say just, there's certain spaces that are definitely building these things out, right? So for my students who major in Spanish, right, or who major or co-major in Spanish and Black studies, right, I would talk about UT Austin's program, because UT Austin has one of the most strongest programs in Latin American studies, and they have a vibrant African diaspora track. So UT Austin, Harvard is building out, University of Pittsburgh is building out, right? So also, and here's one of the things that we may have touched on, but we didn't speak about, preparing them for the tension that comes from African Americanists who don't see value, right, in Afro-Latin American work. Now, I don't like to focus on division, but in terms of preparing the students, right, if they're like, oh, I'm gonna go to this really famous program, but they don't have the faculty there, that's why it's so important to identify the faculty, right? Like, don't go for the name, because you may get there and you're like, oh, you don't have a space. You don't have the folks that are going to support you. I tell students to really hone in on both developing their network of folks, and this, I don't mean formal network, I mean people who love you, and that could be mentors, friends. Develop your network of people who are not at all impressed by whatever degree you have. Like, they don't love you. Their love is not conditioned based on, did you finish that grant proposal? Exactly. Like, it is people who love you, people who know you. And I tell them to go fall in love and go dance and go have a good time and blast Beyonce's Renaissance. And like, because there's so much that the Academy requires. And I want to empower them to understand that they do have agency, because we have colleagues who have never thought of themselves, who have never actively thought about the choices they have made as decisions they have made to repeat the trauma that they have experienced, right? I think when you speak to many academics, right, grad school can be a traumatizing space. For many, like, God bless the folks for whom it is not. I love that. I have a student who's now at Penn State, who she has had an incredibly supportive experience. And I'm so thankful to them for that. And I'm thankful to highlight that there are spaces like that. Many of us do not have those experiences. Many of us have other experiences. And in surviving it, we can then be the lighthouses and the beacons to say, hey, make sure you got your peoples. And that sometimes may not be family, right? Sometimes those are like your friends. Sometimes that could be the people you meet at conferences, may not be, right? And gather those. Again, CLA has always been for me. So, my colleagues in literature, they're like, you always speak of, yes, and you need to know about CLA. Y'all, everybody knows about MLA. But
I understand.
But in terms of, and thinking about, and Asala, thinking about, for historians, thinking about, the Association for Black Women Historians, right? Thinking about, right, those spaces that we have created to support ourselves and each other because we needed to, right? Are so deeply important. And then, and then have the mentors who will hip you to the game, that will say, yeah, you have to make an appearance at an AHA or an OAH. You have to, but at the same time, come over here because we're gonna go to the Caribbean studies, or come over here because we're gonna, and surround yourself with that. But don't be afraid to, you can do the work that you want to do so long as you have support.
Yes.
You can do the work that you want to do so long as, there's somebody who can guide you, right? Because when you're just starting out, not even somebody's who can guide you, and they go, danger. And also pay attention to your spirit. Pay attention to that intuition that, when you meet good peoples, you also know when that interaction that don't feel right for whatever reason, right? And I think, it could be a number of reasons, but don't force it, because there are a lot of things happen when people go, oh, but I thought I was supposed to, right? Meaning my mentor said I should go to conferences, therefore I need to meet everybody, therefore I need to subject myself to, understand that not everybody is for you. Understand, you keep the people who are for you close.
Yes.
So those folks with the PhDs, don't be too impressed by us, truly. Like, let us earn your respect.
Yes.
By our behavior as well as by our work. Because, as you said, the luminaries.
I couldn't say it any better. That is great advice, sage advice. And I give my version of that to undergraduates and grad students who ask me that question as well, related to just Black history or Black studies in general, that same thing. I cannot overstate the value and the sageness of what you just expressed. I had a wonderful experience in graduate school, and it's largely due to that approach and that type of mentoring and advice I was given by my chair, Dr. Pedro Dagbovi, and my committee. And I was able to go to these conferences in National Council of Black Studies, ASALA, and make those connections. Some happen to be luminaries, some happen to be lowly people just like myself, some happen to be lay people who go to these conferences for self-empowerment, self-development, and all of the above. And I tell all, speaking of Pitt and Penn State, so, my little homie, Dr. Eddie Bonilla at Pitt, we went to grad school together. I used to say, hey, we're going to the bar, we're going to dance, we're going to hang out. You know what I'm saying? My former mentee, Dr. Darrell Walker at Penn State, when she was in undergrad, I was doing my master's at Eastern Michigan where I went to undergrad. The same things, and just to see, because that's what the older people told me. And, that was the important thing for me when I was in grad school, just as Dr. Valdés said to anybody that's listening, in Lansing, Michigan, because I did my PhDs at Michigan State, yes, baby, Lansing. That's my daughter. You know, I got married, unfortunately, and divorced, but I conceived her in Lansing. All right, baby. You know, but hey, hanging out with people who weren't academics was
Say
key.
that. Yes.
Key. 90% of my socialization were people who were not academics. They were regular people, school teachers, bus boys, social workers, just regular people who didn't give a damn if I got a perfect score on my essay. None of that. Just if I was a good person or not, and if they regular, it kept me grounded because I saw people get too full of themselves and lost sense of reality, and I saw people lose themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And and for most of them type folk, it didn't turn out too well. They may have finished, but their spirit, their mental health,
Yeah.
you know, it didn't work out too good. So thank you for that advice to all the students, graduate or undergraduate students who are listening or who may come across this later on digital platforms. Please heed that advice. Please heed that advice. Well, thank you so much. I think this was a wonderful conversation. You gave us a lot. You taught us a lot, and you gave us a lot to think about. So thank you so much on behalf of Western Carolina University, of the Global Black Studies Program, and to all of our participants. I just wanted to say that you're a phenomenal teacher and scholar, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for giving for the invitation, and for letting me do what I do, because sometimes I do that, I know. So thank y'all for listening to me. And yeah, it is a pleasure to be in conversation, not only with you specifically, but all of you who are in the audience. Know that we're here, and kudos to you for this platform and for your dedication to expanding global Black studies.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. You as well. Take good care, all.
Yes, ma'am.